Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Andy Ricketts.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be finding out how a Yorkshire charity has built its major donor base almost from scratch in a very short space of time. But first, we're going to spend a few minutes considering one of the most obvious and immediate implications of Labour entering government for one portion of the charity sector. And that is the plan to scrap the VAT exemption on private school fees and also business rate relief. Labour's manifesto pledge to do so was included in the King's speech last week, and the Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson has said even more recently that the government will bring in the change as quickly as possible to raise an estimated £1.6 billion, which Labour says would help fund 6,500 new teachers in the state sector. Now, we're not going to enter the debate of whether or not private schools should have charitable status at all, and this was something that Labour had originally proposed and then scrapped. But for this discussion, we're joined by Chris Fairbank, who is the Director of Communications at the Heads Conference. Also known as HMC, the Heads Conference is an association for head teachers of independent schools in the UK and around the world, and it represents around 300 head teachers in this country, who between them look after more than 270,000 pupils. Hello, Chris.
Hi there.
So, Chris, how do you see the removal of the VAT and business rate exemptions playing out for independent schools?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's a really hard one to answer. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about independent schools is that they're all the same, or that they're all very similar to the ones we think of in our minds that conjure up those images of traditional schools. So the impact, as any kind of change to charity legislation will have effect on different organisations, different sizes in different parts of the country. It's going to make a lot of the activity that schools do on a kind of a day-to-day basis really difficult. It's going to make recruitment of pupils difficult. It's going to make investment really, really difficult. So there's going to be lots of challenges for charities and independent schools that are charities up and down the country. It's going to be a really tough time.
And we know that in 2022, the Scottish Government actually brought into play one aspect of what Labour has proposed, which is scrapping business rate relief for private schools. Have you seen among any of your members in Scotland any significant impact on them and their ability to run?
Yeah, so we have about 25 schools that are based in Scotland, some city ones in Glasgow and Edinburgh, to some schools, in very, very rural circumstances. The change to business rates in Scotland has kind of fundamentally altered the financial playing field that those schools operate within. Most schools in Scotland have gone from having, really strong balance sheets to being in deficit or even at break even. And so they really are struggling to reinvest in the schools themselves, in their staff, in the facilities, in their educational offer. It's really changed the financial picture of the sector in Scotland. And as a result, there are a huge number of very traditional charities in Scotland that are now looking overseas for investment. It's not something that had been considered just a few years ago.
And how do you see the change that Labour wants to bring in playing out in a practical way? Do you think that schools are going to look to pass on most of that additional cost to the parents, or are they going to have to make other changes to the things they do, and indeed some of the other public benefit they offer to the wider communities in which they work?
Yeah, so I'm no tax expert, but my understanding is that VAT is a tax on the consumer. So schools are obliged to pass that cost on. As in any business, it's going to be incredibly hard for any kind of customer to swallow what probably north of 15% overnight. I think it would be really challenging for schools, as the new government have asked them to do, to find savings and efficiencies in their budgets. So I think it would be really tough to find 15, 20% savings overnight. The assumption, like any business, you're running to get a good balance between your costs and your profits. And as we know, these charities aren't making profits. Any kind of surplus is reinvested into education. So I think how that plays out will be really, really tough. I think a number of schools will have to really consider how and where they allocate resources. Schools spend a huge amount of money and time on staff, letting out facilities, providing services and all kinds of things to support their charitable aims and objectives and to support local charities. And all this change is going to do is going to make that work incredibly difficult to maintain and sustain. It's often maligned, but often schools do let out facilities to charities and to community groups at vastly subsidised rates. If they're not able to do that anymore because the financial picture has changed so much, that's only going to have a negative impact on the local community.
And just picking up on that point, I mean, do you see any other kind of unintended consequences of the VAT change for charities that are not independent schools?
As you said, they're unintended, and we're emerging into the point now where there's lots of unknowns. We don't really know the impact that this policy is going to have, and we're trying to prepare our members as best we can for every eventuality. But we know there are specific examples of schools up and down the country that have incredibly close ties with charities and in their local communities. And we're not talking about big national charities, but we're talking about small community-focused hospices and organisations like that. And the work that those schools do is everything will have to be reconsidered and reevaluated in light of this new financial environment that they find themselves in. The assumption that all of this work can continue is a really hard one to justify. But I know from speaking to our members that schools take their charitable status incredibly seriously. Many have held it for a number of years. It's in the very fibre of their being as an educational institution. And so there are two sides to this. In every business that is asking to find costs and savings, look at everything that they do. But I think the assumption that schools will just cut all their public benefit and their external work is also, perhaps a false one. But as I said at the start, every school is in a different scenario. Every school finds themselves in a unique set of circumstances. And so what might be true for one school will certainly not be true for another.
And picking up on that point around the charitable status, I think about half of the 2,500 private schools in England and Wales are registered as charities. With these exemptions removed, how beneficial is a charitable status actually for independent schools?
That's a really, really good question. And again, I'm going to dodge it slightly by saying that that's probably a decision for every single school to make on their own and considering their own circumstances. As I've said, we've been speaking to our members about this issue for a very, very long time. Thankfully, the Labour Party have said that they don't wish to take away charitable status from schools, which I think would have been a legislative nightmare. But I think it's really interesting in terms of how schools respond. As I've said, if we change the financial regulation that any organisation, a charity or not, operates within, it's going to have to respond and to consider all its options. I can't say for certain that X number of schools will go one way or the other, but I'm sure there will be schools and boards of governors, as there would be at any charity, that are sitting there and weighing up all their options and considering what's in the best interests of their children and the future sustainability of that charity as well.
Chris, it's been great to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for joining us.
Wonderful. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Moving on to this week's main discussion. We're going to find out how one charity went from having practically no major donors to a healthy clutch of philanthropists in just a couple of years. We're delighted to be joined by Robyn Mountain Wade, who is the Director of Income Generation at Martin House Children's Hospice in Yorkshire, and has been one of the key people behind the creation of this culture of philanthropy. Hi, Robyn.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Going straight in, please tell us about your major donor journey and your reasons for developing this new fundraising channel for Martin House.
When I joined Martin House, we had very few, if any, what we would call a major donor, that it just didn't exist as a channel. We certainly didn't have a team dedicated to raising funds that way. And to be quite honest, what has sort of accelerated our strategy, as it were, from a major donor point of view, is our build. It's sort of knocked down. It's kind of a refurb and add-on to the current hospice and the provision that we have at the moment. And it's an expensive task. It's a 21.9 million appeal. And we needed to raise that money. And to be fair, we really needed to raise that money quite quickly. And so we were well aware, even from our core source of income streams, that if we keep doing the same things, we're only going to get the same return, basically. So we knew that we really needed to up a gear. We needed to amend our activity and we needed to think big. Now, where we started really was kind of revolutionising the team that we had at Martin House. So we really strengthened the fundraising team in terms of number and experience, etc. So once we had the people in place, we knew that we were able to have a designated team looking at our major donor line. And so that's what we did. And I suppose really from, speaking to people within the charity sector who are aware of philanthropy and major donor as a channel, it's quite an unusual one to start with, given that it's quite a long game. It takes quite a while to instigate those relationships and then nurture them to become to a fruition. But I was quite confident, and so were the team, that actually we probably had people who had the propensity to give, but we just had never asked before. And so we decided to look at those people. Really, we went back to basics and thought, let's have a look at our database and see who has given us, donations of quite large sums. Because if somebody can give us sort of £1,000 a year, there's likelihood that they could probably give us more.
Yeah, just to pick up on the bit of the history then, Robyn, what were you raising previously through the kind of traditional means? And could you talk a little bit about the timescale that you've got in terms of this capital appeal?
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined Martin House at the beginning of 2019. And when I arrived, the organisation was generating approximately between 3 and 4 million from voluntary funds. And just from a core point of view, we needed to double that. I mean, our running costs are approximately 10 million a year. Although we had a planned deficit budget over the years, it was never that much. So we really needed to double, if not more, our income. So we needed to do that without the build, then add on the build, which we launched publicly just in April of this year. But actually what we did was sort of, as many organisations do, we divided our sort of fundraising plan and strategy behind the scenes into a private phase and a public phase. Obviously, as I mentioned, that huge number at the beginning, which is 21.9 million, that's a lot of money. And to go out to the public with that, it makes people think, what does my £10, what impact is that going to have, my £1, my £10? So we probably started the private phase around, I suppose the planning of the strategy was sort of 2021-ish, but we actually got our first major gift, which we were very fortunate enough to get a £3 million sort of lead gift, what we'd call a lead gift, and that was in around 22. I think really the main activity has been in the last year, so sort of starting in 23. And when I say the main activity, I mean that proactive, the sort of the things that we're going to talk about today, the way in which we started to host events, etc. And we were brave enough to ask, really.
So you didn't have all that many major donors before purely because you'd never thought to ask as an organisation. But now you have, and you've got this target and you've got a timeline in which you want to raise the funds to do your necessary building work.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about the how. How are you engaging new donors?
Yeah, so as I say, we started at the beginning. We looked through our database and tried to find people who had, probably just on paper looked like they had the propensity to give. And we invited them to come and hear more about Martin House and what we're doing. Because I think sometimes, particularly as a small organisation, it's easy to sort of think, particularly in our geographical locality, that everybody knows what we're doing. And they don't, actually. And that's one thing we have distinctly learned, that we could have somebody who lives on the same high street as the hospice and absolutely have no idea behind the scenes of what actually goes on. So we started to invite people to our events, and we are very lucky to have a wonderful ambassador, which is very prevalent at the moment. It's Gareth Southgate, and he was incredibly supportive of helping us in any which way he can. He's also a very modest man, so didn't want it to be all about him. He kind of wanted to enhance what activity we were doing, which is exactly what we did. So we started by hosting some quite low level at the time events in which it was sort of a dinner, drinks reception, a dinner. Gareth would join. So obviously there was a little bit of an attraction. If you didn't want to hear about Martin House, you may want to hear about Gareth and his football career. So that was an excellent, a bit of a hook for us, as it were. And we started to host these dinners. Now, the other thing that we've done, which I think is probably a bit of gold for us, really, and so it seems silly not to share that with other organisations, is that we realised that within philanthropy and major donor and that type of thing, it can actually be quite a small world, particularly in Yorkshire. And actually one of the key things for us was that black book. We talk about the black book in fundraising quite a lot. And what we realised after hosting our first dinner was that actually people wanted to do similar themselves on our behalf. So we had a couple who very kindly offered to host a dinner of a similar nature to what we had done. Some did invite Gareth, some didn't. And they opened their black book. So it was almost a bit of a domino effect. We benefited from them coming to learn at our dinner about Martin House and everything that we were trying to achieve. And then they almost held their own dinner. Of course, we attended and we helped them with that, but really they kind of endorsed it. And so they got guests that possibly we wouldn't reach without them and their black book, as it were. Something that we seem to have done is really appeal to Yorkshiremen. I often say that Gareth always starts, whenever he does share his story, as it were, at these dinners, he starts by saying, I am an honorary Yorkshireman, please allow me in here, because he's actually, from the south. It is a small world, and we had a lot of people in Yorkshire who were really invested in what Martin House was doing. And so we've sort of enhanced that a bit further, in that we're actually hosting an event a little later in the year at the House of Lords, obviously in London. And our sort of target audience for that really is Yorkshire people who have fled Yorkshire and are sort of, making their business, etc., in London, but still have a real vested interest in Yorkshire and the things that we can, develop, particularly medically. So I'd say that's been a real success for us in that way.
Really, really interesting. And that idea of giving local people with their own network and contacts ownership of the fundraising events, I think is an interesting concept. Was there any problem associated with that from the charity side? Like, did you feel that perhaps they were organising the event in a different way to how you might have done?
So, yeah, I'd say the two sort of things that we sort of faced but overcame was exactly that, actually, Lucinda, was that they would probably do it in a very different way to we do. I think as fundraisers, you have a bit of a working regime and you stick to that. There's a bit of a welcome drinks, there may be a little bit of fundraising at the beginning, you may share a bit of a story, that type of thing. And actually what we did, and I think we were brave enough to do, and I'm proud that we did this, was just say, do you know what, they're your friends, they're your guests, you do it how you want. And at times it was difficult to sit there and say, oh, I don't know, should we have a dinner as opposed to just canapes, or some really basic things like that. But then the other thing that we sort of learned really was that where we had the most useful and meaningful events hosted by another was when we'd really sort of enrich them with what Martin House is and what we're trying to achieve. So it's about engaging them and really educating them.
I'm wondering, Robyn, how you get people to the next level, if you like. I mean, I imagine it's not that difficult to get somebody to come to an event hosted by the then England football manager in Gareth Southgate. But then how do you kind of move things on and actually get them to dig into their pockets and give you some money? What are your sort of tips in terms of how charities might do that?
I think that exact sort of leading on from what I was just saying a little bit, it is making that relevance to your audience. So, obviously Martin House looks after children, and children, it's a hugely emotive subject, whether you're a parent or not. However, it doesn't affect everybody. And so really for us, it was about making sure that they understood some of the things that we're doing. So we're fortunate at Martin House to have 3 specialist paediatric consultants that work here. And if you think there's only 18 in the country and 3 of them are here, it's really quite amazing. We're ahead of the curve in the service that we deliver. And so it's about making sure that people sort of understood that and really could see how sort of revolutionising we are trying to be in this small pocket of Yorkshire. The service that we provide is really, really advanced for such a small and regional charity. I mean, we have a huge education programme that's going to be even bigger when we achieve this build, but that's the sort of thing that we were like, we need to shout about this, and it's about recognising that there is something worth shouting about. The other thing that we did, which I'm not sure that really as an organisation we'd ever done before, is obviously we know the amount of money we need to deliver our build and our ambitious aims. And we know kind of the time frame that the physicality of the build is going to take. And we also have to be really nitty gritty about it. The events I'm talking about are quite intimate. I'm talking numbers of maximum 25, including staff and Gareth. And we were able to share some of that sort of more, I wouldn't say it was sort of private information, but some of that detailed information with these potential donors. And what that allowed us to do was talk more about pledges as opposed to immediate sort of donations. I think many people, particularly at that level, who are obviously invited to many things and probably get to sit around the table with many people as special as Gareth, far more than I do, as it were. Sometimes they think that they're coming and it's about emptying their pocket, that evening, or writing a check with a few zeros on the end, where what we spoke about was almost a more lasting commitment, a pledged sort of amount of money that they could give us maybe over a period of time or at a time when something worked for them business-wise. So I'd say that pledges had been a bit of a game changer for us at Martin House, because it meant people didn't have to commit that evening to that and transfer the cash, as it were, by the morning. It was more of they just committed to support us over a period of time. And that is where we're at now with many of these donors that we've met at these events.
So practically, how are you actually making that ask? I mean, if you really get it down to brass tacks, are you actually asking them face to face at those meetings, please, can you give us some money? Or is it more of an ongoing email or letter type conversation?
Our chief exec is wonderful. She's a Yorkshire lady. She used to be our director of care. So she's absolutely understands all aspects of the hospice. And so along with Gareth, we have brought the chief exec to every dinner. And as part of that, she has shared what we're trying to achieve and the urgency and why and what it means to families, and shared some of the planning around what it is that we need and why we need it. And as a result of that, she always ends with, and we need your help to do that. We can't make this legacy that we want to leave in Yorkshire for children and families across Yorkshire without your help. And that help doesn't have to be financial. Clearly, we've talked the numbers, which she will always explain the numbers and say where we're at with a genuine transparency so people understand that. But then she will also say sometimes it is endorsement. You may not be in a position to give us a check or commit to supporting us financially, but what you could do is host a dinner of this nature. And we have been probably more bolder than we've ever been before. And the reason for that is genuine urgency in that, we need to deliver this build. And we've right now, we're fortunate we literally have builders on site, and we don't want that to stop. We're still trying to deliver care. We're a live open site. And so without those funds, at one point, there was a time when we may have to stop that and pause and start again. And that's not what we want. So we've really shared the urgency. And again, I realise as a hospice how fortunate we are that we've got that urgency. We're really trying to employ a lot of tactics, as it were, and strategy to ensure that we can carry over this legacy of major donor giving to our core income streams. I think what I would also say, which I think possibly if there's another hospice listening to this thinking, do you know what, we really do need to do the same, I'd say that we really are following that textbook rule of an 80-20, in that if you look at where we are with our appeal now, which to date is just under 10 million, which is extraordinary and is literally testament to a hardworking team and some quick thinking plans, I would say that we have seen genuinely about 80% of our income coming from 20% of our donors, which just shows the gravitas of major donor giving as a channel of income. And I would say that with an appeal or not, I would definitely say it's inflated us. It's given us that step up, the appeal, and so has Gareth. But I'm really confident that the things we've trialled recently, we can carry over to the core income, which will become even more vital after we deliver this build.
You're making all of this sound really easy. You hadn't thought to ask major donors before. You bring along Gareth Southgate and your chief executive to some small events with potential large-scale donors. You get the right messaging across, a sense of urgency, and you've achieved incredible results so far. It can't have been that easy. Could you tell us about any challenges that you have encountered along the way?
Absolutely. Of course, it hasn't been that easy. And I think if the team was listening to this, they would say, it has been really difficult, really pressured. So I would say the main things that we struggled with has been, we are quite small. We are a regional charity doing amazing things, but we're not national. So we're not a powerhouse like, the huge Macmillans, Alzheimer's of the charity sector. We're not a powerhouse. And we had to recognise that. And I would say as a result of that, what we have really tried to instill in the team is a bit of a culture of it's okay to be brave enough to realise when it's not going to work, which we did. We went down a few paths with donors that we thought would really, really support us and really get behind what we're trying to achieve. And it became quite apparent that that wasn't the case. And instead of trying to persevere and make that work, we accepted that, that won't work, but there's something else will. So I think that we've really learned that. I'd say the other thing has been timing. I mean, there's nothing quite like the pressure of a huge amount of money and a build to deliver, knowing that the children and families of Yorkshire need this and that we want to deliver it with the least disruption possible to make us all up a gear. We really did pull our socks up and think this needs to happen. No isn't isn't an option. And I think that would lead me to saying that genuinely, and I hope it doesn't sound too fluffy, but the gear change for us has been belief, has been really believing that as a small regional hospice sitting in Yorkshire, we're doing amazing things and we're trying to achieve and deliver amazing things. And that's worth putting on everyone's radar. And some people will believe in that and join our journey with us, and some won't. And I think it was really believing that what we had to shout about was worth shouting about. And so we've cancelled events. We've had events that I was talking to you about, we have had to cancel because actually we had sort of people pull out or something near the time, and all of those things could be put down to things like a time frame. It was November and people are fleeing the country by then, particularly the type of donors that we were trying to reach, because they're going out of the country for Christmas. And so it was sort of looking realistically and still keeping that belief that actually it's not us that they don't want to hear about. It's not our event. It's not what we're trying to achieve. It could just be a logistics game that we all face. So genuinely, I would say, if you are steadfast in what you are trying to achieve, and it absolutely needs to happen, it is maintaining that belief and carrying on regardless, and shouting about what you are trying to achieve. And the right people will listen, and that the right people are who you need on your journey. Because whilst it's nice to have sort of intermittent support and, somebody coming in saying, look, we'll help you with this, what we really want is a legacy of support. We want people to buy into this hospice and to care where we are in 10, 15, 20 years. And I'd say that we have been so far so fortunate in doing that, in securing that support that's really meaningful support.
In terms of the challenges there, I mean, we know that some major donors, I think of like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, that have ploughed billions of dollars into curing malaria. Mm-hmm. Obviously, children's hospices provide an incredible service, but they're not kind of solving a problem, and sadly, they're not able to make that problem go away. Yeah. Is that a challenge for you? And can you talk about how you've dealt with that?
Again, that comes back to that relevance. I think it also comes back to the build. We're very fortunate to have tangible, and people like to see a tangible change. But I think for us, it is about how we land the relevance with everybody. And so, for example, not many people are aware, but at Mountain House, we would also not only support people with life-limiting conditions from birth to 18, 19, 20, we also look after and support families who are unfortunately victims of sudden death. So that is traffic accidents, suicide, a whole array of things, which actually that is relevant to everybody, because we have no idea what can and can't happen. But I think there's a bit of a stigma with children's hospices. Another challenge that I forgot to mention was that some people really don't want to visit the hospice. They don't want to come because they think it's a very sad place, where children die, and of course it is. It's all of those things. It's emotional, it's heartbreaking, it's very, very sad, but it's also actually, especially for those children who come and benefit from our respite care, it's also magical. When we're not a building site, the memories, genuine memories that are made in our gardens that we can hear in the fundraising offices, they're just unbelievable. The care team and what they try to bring to the days of these young people's lives is just phenomenal. And really, we have just been, again, steadfast in sort of sharing the importance of that this sounds absolutely devastational, but we often talk about you've only got one chance to get a child's death right. And so we want to help that. We want to be able to facilitate that outside of a hospital setting that can be often very clinical, can be restricting. We want to help families almost build the memories that they deserve around that. And I think really when you talk about that, when you start to bring that to life for people and talk about the impact and the direct benefits that we bring to the children and families that use our services, it's hard for that not to resonate with anyone.
Robyn, it's been so inspiring listening to you. Thank you so much for taking us behind the scenes of your major donor journey, and all the best with the remaining target that you have to reach.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Robyn, and that's it for this week. We heard about the value of the small events that Robyn and her team have been putting on at Mountain House, but next week we'll be back to talk about the challenges of putting on large-scale charity events post-COVID. Please do follow the Third Sector podcast on the platform you use, and we'd really appreciate a positive rating or review. For now, thank you to our guests, Robyn and Chris. Our producer is Nav Pal.